programme is not just about India. It's about India and wine and war at sea and electricity and steam engines and love affairs and wallpaper and other stuff. So this opening sequence is not what it seems. However, to avoid confusion, throughout the programme, I'll keep you posted with regular feedback. Oh, hi. Could you hold it for a second? Thanks. Okay, access the uplink now. Sorry about that. Well, here we are, intrepid reporter James Burke, in one of the more remote parts of India, ready to start the show. A show that travels across the great web of knowledge through space and time to find the strangest connections between things. And all that stuff you've heard before. I suppose in a way, you know, the whole connections concept is a product of the technology. Because back before the technology, you couldn't have seen life that way. I mean, the way everything is connected. Because back then, it wasn't. 100 years ago, for instance, I'd have been really cut off here, really intrepid. 50 years ago, 100 miles to the nearest telegraph office. 20 years ago, 50 miles to the nearest phone. Today, this laptop, this cell phone, and that satellite, and bingo, here goes my script update back to the office in London. Okay, I'll send it now. This is what life in the 21st century is going to be all about. Wherever you are, Siberia, Paris, Manhattan, all of us living on the great network that will connect everybody, able to be and do anything, free from the limitations of space and time, with the world at your fingertips. But only if we learn to live with one important little thing in cyberspace, our other selves, the electronic version of you that lives in the system and works for you night and day, does anything you want, sometimes even before you know you want it. Watch this. Run the agent program.
Good morning, James. You have 3 appointments today, and it's your mother's birthday, so I've sent pink roses. George's electronic agent says could the next Wednesday meeting be Friday? I've confirmed you're free, and we've changed both your diaries. Your checking account is close to redline, so I've topped it up. Don't forget it's your anniversary next week. I've checked out some things she likes, okay? Your blood test came back. You're fine. I've completed the company upcoming tax returns, if you want to review them. Top temperature today, 95. Your conference call's at 9, and I've reminded everybody else's electronic agent. That's it.
Good, eh? And maybe for some people, a bit scary. Because there's one thing that has to happen if the electronic agent really is supposed to be another you. The agent has to know you intimately. Every detail of your every day, every moment of your business life, your spending habits and those of your nearest and dearest, your personal friends, doctor's records, spare time activities, and every phone call you ever make. And when you go anywhere, see anybody, buy anything, break a law, tell a lie, catch a cold, it knows. And on the network, it doesn't matter where you do that. It knows. And then it analyzes and records and updates your behavior profile. And that's how it learns to be you. And it does that thanks to the most fundamental element in all learning. Something that also kind of won the last World War, and every war since. Feedback. Feedback is what stops this happening, because it stops this happening. German missiles going just too fast for people on the ground to hit. Until feedback, the magic idea thought up by MIT and Bell Labs for tracking the missile and then using fancy math to predict from the radar data where the missile is likely to be a few seconds from now. Then you keep feeding those predictions to the guys trying to shoot the missile down. So instead of shooting at where the thing is, they shoot at where it's going to be. By 1943, the predictors, as they're called, are able to do this. The feedback trick improves the artillery's success rate to the point where Hitler stops trying. And by 1944, thanks to feedback, Allied guns everywhere are hitting anything that moves. And people are beginning to drink to the end of the war being in sight. Appropriate, really, when you think of where the idea of feedback came from in the first place. It's all due to a guy who is a French winemaker and who happens to find out what goes on inside you when you do things, I'm happy to say, like this. Cheers. His name is Claude Bernard, and he lives here in this house, in one of the more beautiful bits of countryside in the world, just outside. Why don't you enjoy that, while I enjoy this? This is the Beaujolais country, in the heart of France, where some of the world's best wines come from. And it's every bit as delightful as it looks. Ironic that it should have inspired Claude Bernard to do the awful things he did. Coming up after another minute or so of this enjoyable tourist stuff. Right in the middle of the Beaujolais country, this is that guy's vineyard, and that over there is his house. And this is the reason he's in this programme. Because back in mid-19th century, Claude Bernard, who's a doctor as well as a winemaker, notices something rather funny about, well, rabbit wee-wee. He discovers that if you give a rabbit regular meals to eat, its urine is cloudy and alkaline. But if a rabbit's had no food for a while, its urine goes clear and acid. This earth-shattering observation gets Claude Bernard all excited about stomachs and gastric juices and other such internal matters. And here, in his farmhouse, he decides to take a closer, more scientific look. And he finds out about the way that rabbits and humans automatically switch to living off their fat if they don't get any food. That's why the urine changes. Further investigation also reveals that if you're short of sugar, your liver dumps more sugar into your bloodstream. And that there's a whole string of reactions like that going on in your body. Feedback reactions that keep all your body levels the way they're supposed to be. Like if you need water, you get thirsty and drink. If you're hot, you sweat and cool down. Other people pick up on this stuff and sure enough find out about more feedback systems working to control the level of things like adrenaline, sex hormones and other chemicals that kick in when you're attracted or scared or angry or cold and so on. All part of the marvellous body feedback mechanism working to preserve what Claude labels the inner balance. We today would call it homeostasis. And it's from physiologists working on homeostasis that those wartime predictor people you saw get their ideas for those anti-aircraft feedback fire control systems, remember? Oh, while we're here, take a look at the kind of science Claude Bernard is doing in 1860. Great big scales, because they're still finding out what everything weighs. Giant glass containers for boiling and condensing and reducing, kind of science as cookery almost. And then you write it all up in pen and ink, because this is before even typewriters. But then, in contrast, look at this. The kind of delicate precision instruments craftsmen handcraft back then. Beautiful, eh? This one's particularly relevant. See, Claude's discovery of how your insides work is great news for medicine, but not such great news for rabbits, or guinea pigs, dogs, frogs, cats, rats, horses, or any of the many experimental animals that young medical students now start to investigate the workings of, in the interest of discovery, or of just getting qualified. Vivisection, it's called, using instruments like this on animals like this. As a result of which, Claude's wife, well, leaves him and joins some animal rights people, one of whom is trying to kill Claude with something that science at the time has not yet discovered: thought waves. The real movers and shakers in anti-vivisection at the time are the English, because up to now they've treated animals worst of anybody and have now decided it's time to develop a soft spot for man's best friends. So as early as 1822, there's a Society for the Protection of Animals from Vivisection, and its leading light is a formidable lady called Cobb, whose followers start to call themselves humane societies, in spite of the fact that it was this kind of behaviour the original humane societies were set up to handle, saving what's described as the apparently drowned from various watery graves. That kind of humane stuff really hits the headlines here at a place called Bamborough in the northeast of England, a place famous for its ancient castle and even more famous for its lousy winter weather. Rarely lousier than at 5 in the morning on September the 7th, 1838, when a luxury steamer with 68 people on board heading for Scotland breaks up in a humongous storm out there off the Farne Islands, and everybody goes down except for 9 people clinging to the rocks, and fortunately for them, spotted by the young daughter of the local lighthouse man. The girl, Grace Darling, and her dad make 2 death-defying trips, rescue all the survivors, and trigger massive public support for more of the same. As a result of which, if you're ever clinging to the rocks, with a bit of luck, this will happen. Lifeboats is what Grace Darling starts, and early on they look like this, covered in cork to make them unsinkable, with 5 pairs of oars. Eventually this design gets used all over the world. So, thanks to anti-missile feedback and Claude Bernard's vivisection and humane societies, here we are on the way to help somebody in distress from becoming an apparently drowned.
We're south by southeast of the Pinnacles and due west of the Longston Light.
Now, it has to be said that back in 1854, when lifeboat associations really get going, it isn't all volunteer altruism, although there's a lot of that. No, rescuing people back then tends to be something you do on the way to rescuing their cargo. Because what with industrial production going up in Europe and America, and raw materials by the 1,000 tons crossing the ocean, there's a lot more shipping out there. So there's a lot more money out there. But there's another reason for all those ships, as I'm sure you've guessed. And it's linked to a new seafaring habit of chucking bottles over the side. Now, it's not often a bottle changes the course of history, but this is no ordinary bottle, as you will see. Meanwhile, all that extra shipping out there, which is out there thanks to a young American naval officer who knows more about what goes on at sea than you could shake a crab net at. This guy is so hot at oceanography, like how far winds and currents will take you at particular times of the year, that one day, when an American troop ship gets hit by a gigantic storm in the Atlantic, our pal, Matthew Maury, marks a cross on the chart. And that's exactly where the rescue ship finds the survivors floating in the water days later. Pretty good, eh? Maury's able to do that X marks the spot stuff because by 1847 he spent years going through more than 1 million observations on wind and currents from piles of dusty old ships' logbooks that the Department of the Navy have hung on to but never done anything about. And that's why I'm here, in posh academic surroundings, with a bunch of people who owe their careers to the bottle, if you get my drift. And if you don't, you soon will.
Attention on deck.
Thank you. Take seats. The end result of all Maury's data collecting is basic training in every navigation class today. Basically, what Maury comes up with is a kind of roadmap of the sea, showing, well, the expressways. This is one of his best examples, the Gulf Stream. You jump on this 50-mile wide current going across the Atlantic that way, at a time of the year when Maury tells you the winds are also going that way, and you will be across the Atlantic quicker than you can say path of minimum time sailing, which is what Maury calls this trick, using winds and currents instead of a straight line to go from any A to any B, thus saving a lot of time and, more important, a lot of money. So Maury produces a book called Sailing Directions and keeps it updated because every navigator gets a free copy of this book from the US government as long as they agree to fill in a form every day of a voyage with temperature, pressure, speed and direction of wind and currents, and so on. And at certain times, throw over the side a bottle, corked of course, with a bit of paper inside saying date, time and position. See? Oh, and pick up any other bottle they happen to see floating by. As a result of all this, not surprisingly, Maury becomes an international weather biggie, which is why he gets to organize the first international weather conference in Brussels in 1853, where he talks everybody into standard formats for weather charts. The other thing Maury is hot for is a weather reporting network that will use the latest wonder technology, a new gizmo called the telegraph, which of course bumps Maury into Sam Morse, well known by history for having invented the Morse code, and almost entirely forgotten by history for something else. But before we get to that, why are we doing all this about Maury here? Because this place was his idea. It's where you become a career naval officer like Maury, the United States Naval Academy. Okay, enough of the fun. Now for Sam Morse, Revelations of Thwarted Ambition and Conspiracy Theory. And where better for such revelations than the home of such revelations, Capitol Hill.
The court is in session. All rise.
The evidence would seem to indicate that Mr. Matthew Maury and all those other weather experts are able to exchange data thanks to a trip Mr. Samuel Morse takes back from Europe to America in 1832, during which he, quote, invents, unquote, the telegraph. In fact, any court in the land would agree that he's probably the 6th person to do so. Anyway, back in New York, let me see. He reads up on electricity, picks everybody's brains, and has the two ideas that make his telegraph the one that will end up famous rather than anybody else's. Exhibit A, the key you tap with, and Exhibit B, the code you tap.
The Morse code. In 1844, here in the old US Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., before astonished members of Congress, Sam Morse powers up his contraption and blows everybody away with what must have seemed a little short of magic. An instant message all the way from Baltimore, 45 miles away, he says, and here it comes, now. And this happens.
And the rest, as they say, is history. The history everybody knows. Now for the less known bit. And get ready for some culture.
This is the Capitol Building Rotunda in Washington, and the next bit of the story.
The reason Morse is on that ship back from Europe, remember? Is because he's been over there painting this kind of stuff, for which he's already quite famous. I mean, he's president of the National Academy of Art and Design in New York, for a start. So you won't be surprised to know that in terms of what happens next, he pretty much reckons he's got the picture.
Thing is, back in 1836, they haven't quite finished building the rotunda, and of the decoration and stuff left to do, the main job the Rotunda Art Committee still have to commission is for a set of 4 giant paintings like this one, a commission which Sam Morse's pitch to the committee kind of takes for granted.
Take a look at this, gentlemen, and you'll see that important themes are my stock in trade. This is called the Gallery of the Louvre in Paris. I mean, I think big. So a job like the Rotunda for a man of my talents would be a piece of cake, right? Wrong. The problem is, Morse is a political loony. He believes that the Pope is infiltrating Catholics into Missouri in preparation for an armed uprising, that there is a foul foreign conspiracy against these United States, and that very soon there will be an American world empire. Well, you can imagine the reaction of the Rotunda Art Committee, can't you? Don't call us. Morse is so ticked off, he gives up painting for good. Still, as you know, he makes a fortune with the Telegraph. Can't win them all. Meanwhile, why was he on that trip to Europe in the first place? Well, as I said, boning up on European art in preparation for this presentation. And also spending some time with his big hero, a fellow who had the kind of disease most of us would like to have.
The disease in question is a condition for which the only cure, even today, is trips to Italy. And Sam Morse's hero is nuts about the place, especially this place, the tiny hill town of Alevino Romano, just south of Rome, where the food and the wine and the people and the architecture and the sun and the olive groves will do to you what they do to this gent here, Washington Allston, who turns up in 1805 so that he can do what all romantic painters did, go totally over the top about how, well, Italian Italy is. Now, clearly, this programme hasn't suddenly turned into an art history class. As usual, there's more to all this than meets the eye. First of all, because Allston goes on to become America's leading romantic painter, which is why Morse worships him and why he's in this programme. And because, apart from mooning around, hugging trees and smelling the flowers, and taking his sketches home and filling them with classical maidens and Greek temples and all that good stuff, Allston gets mixed up with a rather dubious type I'm quite sure the puritanical Sam Morse never knew about. The chap I have in mind turns up here to visit and accompanies Allston on his daily commune with nature, while they discuss the meaning of life. Only, however, on those very rare days when the gentleman in question is in a fit state to discuss anything.
And the name of this candidate for the rehab clinic? Romantic poetry hotshot Samuel Taylor Coleridge, one of the greatest scribblers and drug addicts in English lit, and who spends time over in Alevino Romano, Italy, visiting Allston on his way back to England from this delightful spot, the holiday island of Malta, where he's been up to some pretty strange shenanigans.
But before I dish the dirt, a quick catch-up on the story so far. Electronic agents on the internet and wartime guns use feedback techniques discovered in the first place by Claude Bernard, whose vivisection experiments kick off all those animal rights movements called humane societies. that really start out as lifeboat crews, rescuing people from all the shipwrecks happening because of all the extra ships out there who are using Maury's data on wind and currents, transmitted by the amazing new telegraph invented by Sam Morse, who's also a painter, whose hero is Washington Allston, who spends time in Italy with Coleridge, who is, as I said, here in Malta.
And, as you will see, spending a lot of time writing back to London. OK, on with the story. What Coleridge is up to here is travelling all over the island on picnics and jolly trips to the countryside, and at the same time working for the contemporary British equivalent of the CIA, and trying and failing miserably to get over his rather unfortunate habit, which is to take humongous amounts of opium 4 or 5 times a day and get totally off the wall. So, surprise, surprise, Coleridge is in Malta for his health. By this time, his marriage is also on the rocks, and he's broke, has rheumatism, gout, heart problems, paranoia, hypochondria, and a giant guilt complex about various kinds of sin, and he's only 32. Oh, and he has written some great poetry, most of it hallucinatory. Now, as I said, Coleridge isn't just taking in the scenery here. By day, he's doing the 007 act, deeply involved with For Your Eyes Only stuff. On hush-hush missions he won't talk about, for the fellow running this place, the British governor of Malta, a navy type called Alexander Ball. That's Coleridge by day. By night, he's burning the candle as rewrite man on Governor Ball's secret reports back to London about all the spying and skullduggery going on here. Because Malta, in mid-Mediterranean, see, is just where everybody wants to be.
Russia wants a Mediterranean outpost, France wants to stop them, Britain wants to stop France. And America's having a war with Libya and needs a local base.
So the island is what you might call a classic hotbed of intrigue, as they say in stuffier programmes than this. Well, you get the point about Coleridge. Malta's the last place for a romantic poet to get a lot of musing and scribbling done. So he doesn't. And by 1806, he's getting seriously worried about his literary output, with good reason, because there isn't any. So he heads for home via Olevino Romano, where he will stay with Allston, leaving behind the good governor, Alexander Ball,
whose attitude to drug addict poets is typically navy, shape up or ship out. Alexander Ball gets that governor's job in the first place because back in 1798 he's a navy captain fighting the French and gets orders to join a new squadron in the Mediterranean.
The job of the squadron is to keep tabs on Napoleon.
His fleet is rumoured to be in the French port of Toulon, here. Now, British intelligence says his plan is to cross the Mediterranean and invade Egypt, here.
But just in case his real plan is to go for Britain, the Brits are covering their bets here, as well as blockading the other big French naval port of Brest, here, as well as hanging around another possible bolt hole for the French fleet in Cadiz, here. So the Brits are stretched pretty thin. Turns out Napoleon's real target is Egypt after all.
So he slips out of Toulon with 29 warships and arms and ammunition up the yin-yang, everything they need to take over Egypt. Now, this is a catastrophe in the making, and all there is to stop Napoleon is Alexander Ball, his boss, and 6 measly little ships.
And then up comes a gale.
The Brits get driven way down here off Sardinia, so there's nobody to prevent Napoleon making it all the way to Egypt and taking over as planned.
And this is where Ball gets that job in Malta. There they are, in the teeth of a storm. His boss's flagship has lost its mast and Ball is towing him. The winds are up to force 10, the seas are humongous, they're nearly on the rocks, and the boss signals, "Cut loose and leave me." The aptly named Ball signals, "No way." Things are looking pretty disastrous, and then, at the last minute, in the nick of time, the storm abates, and it all ends like Hollywood, as you knew it would.
It just so happens the guy whose life Ball has just saved is Admiral Horatio Nelson, the great British hero, who promptly thanks Ball by making him governor of Malta. Down here, you remember. While Nelson himself nips off to mop up Napoleon at the Battle of the Nile.
From which he then sails off for some R&R and all the pasta the crew can eat to Italy, here.
It's in Naples that Nelson comes across the hottest thing he's ever seen. No, not Vesuvius. A lady called Emma Hamilton. These two are about to make history. And this is where they will meet. Naples, a city that has welcomed sailors with open arms for centuries. The place for food, fun and frolic. And Emma Hamilton's husband is giving her enough rope, so she's spending most of her time partying with the locals. The elderly Hamilton is hardly the ideal match for a dish like Emma, so she's in the market for some pretty fishy stunts with the local gentry, including one I can't possibly show you. So try this spaghetti eating contest instead. But Emma knows her ship will come in if she plays her cards right.
Well, it does, and I bet you've guessed who's on it. Yes, in 1798, the megastar Admiral Horatio Nelson arrives in Naples. Everybody faints in fashionable style, especially Emma. There are parties where Emma distributes buttons and ribbons with HN on them. She also entertains Nelson wearing no underwear, and not surprisingly, they become friends. Nelson persuades his wife to stay back home with tales of how Italy's bad for your health. And eventually he and Emma return here to England, where she has his child, and they hit the tabloids, so to speak. He leaves again for sea, is killed at the Battle of Trafalgar, and that's it. One of history's greatest soap operas. The grieving Emma lives on, widow of the nation's role model. Not bad for a gal who got a start in what can only be described as shocking circumstances.
Doors have been opening for Emma since she was a hooker aged 14, from which she graduates to be mistress of various aristocrats. She hits the big time around 1780, pouring drinks for the well-heeled suckers who are flocking into London's latest health and beauty salon with a difference, where they charge you, in more senses than one, with electric shocks. Dr. James Graham claims his current treatment will generate a galvanizing effect on anybody who has a spark of life in them and wants to be a real live wire. And if you think that sentence was dreadful, you should read Graham's original sales pitch. But where Graham really scores is with his electrico-magnetico-celestial bed, where, if you can't have children, a few high-voltage sessions with the good doctor, and from then on, all your troubles will be little ones. Now, this may all look like indictable offences to you, but you've got to remember that back then, this is high-tech amazement. I mean, who knows? This quack is a fully paid-up member of the respectable professional classes, a friend of Benjamin Franklin and various dukes and duchesses. And of course, he's studied at the best medical school in Britain, Edinburgh, where he is taught by a fellow with a drinking problem.
The problem in question is being solved by Graham's prof, Dr. Joe Black, here in Bonnie, Scotland, for the people who make this delicious stuff. Here's how they do that. Well, more or less. Fire heats up the whiskey mash, it makes steam. You run the steam through a jacket of cold water, which condenses the steam into drips of whiskey. And that's still all there is to a still. Except, of course, for the secret magic ingredient of the whiskey mash. Okay, Black's job for the distillers is to quantify how much fire you need to make how much steam, to be condensed by how much water, to give you how much whiskey. In the inebriating course of these researches, Black discovers that steam is so scalding hot because it has a massive amount of heat in it. Latent heat, he calls it. So he tells James Watt. And that's why Watt comes up with a steam engine that works so well, it kicks off the Industrial Revolution. And the legend is he does it here, in a place called Bowness, near Edinburgh, in this very cottage. Well, ruin. Standing, however, in the grounds of something rather grander.
In 1764, Kinneil House is being rented by a yuppie coal mine owner called Roebuck, who backs Watt's steam engine research, and then his coal mines flood out and he goes bankrupt before Watt can finish his work. The two of them split amicably enough. It's nobody's fault, and there's not much point, is there, in crying over spilt milk? Appropriately enough, spilt milk is the reason Roebuck makes his money in the first place. See, this is the old way to bleach cotton, soaked in sour milk for 6 weeks. A lot of time and a lot of real estate. Until Roebuck comes up with the better way, cheaper and faster. But the bleachers aren't keen, with good reason, because although Roebuck's new stuff will bleach in 24 hours and costs a lot less, a sulfuric acid's not exactly user-friendly if you happen to spill it. So, thanks to the electrical Graham's link with Black, who introduced Watt to Roebuck, here we are, about to see the bleach fields disappear forever, when somebody now invents a way to bleach cloth just like the way you do it in your washing machine today. This somebody is called Tennant, and he takes a scientific approach. First he makes chlorine gas, and then mixes it with lime and water, and comes up with a magic liquid that will put all these people out of work. Tennant's bleaching liquid relocates the bleaching industry into factories, and when he produces a powdered version of the stuff, you can bleach clothes in the comfort of your own kitchen. So the bleach fields go back to being moorland, and Tennant goes on to become a paper millionaire. Ironic, considering what his bleaching powder does to paper. Here's an important bit of paper I'll get to in a second. Meanwhile, where are we? Remember Coleridge in Malta, where he worked for Captain Alexander Ball, who saves Nelson's life so he can fall for the dubious Emma, whose electrical start in life was with Dr. Graham, educated in Scotland by the whiskey experimenter Joe Black, who's friends with the sulfuric Roebuck, whose bleaching techniques are improved by Tennant, who gets rich by making things whiter than white.
Not, however, this important bit of paper. The American Declaration of Independence. Have you ever noticed how American documents from this period are all kind of mud-coloured, and the English stuff from the same time is grey? That's because they're made from rags, and whatever colour the rags are, you get. Well, Tennant's new bleach makes paper white at last, because it does the same to the rags, no matter what the cloth, no matter what the pattern on them. And the need for good white paper is on the rise, like everything else in the Industrial Revolution. Which is why, around 1812, a new French patent makes such a big hit here in London.
Take a lot of bleached pulp made from rags and spread it evenly on a wire mesh belt, which is vibrating to shake all the water out. Then run the damp pulp between a series of heated rollers, and what you get is cheap enough to stick on the walls. And cover with fancy designs, too.
And the printing is mechanised by now too, because in 1840 a Yorkshire cotton printing firm comes up with a way for printing paper with rollers. Between them, mechanized papermaking and roller printing make life in the modern world just that little bit more fun for young homeowners because they make possible cheap wallpaper. And this is where things take a left-hand turn for the decorative, the medieval, and the socialist.
This is the medieval bit. By the mid-19th century, the Romantic movement has everybody nostalgic for the Middle Ages and what life was like before they built the factory down the street. So real aesthetes turn their homes into kind of Victorian versions of the 15th century with gaslight. Into this radical chic world of historical inaccuracy comes a failed architect who is hot stuff at the new rustic simplicity, name of William Morris, who promptly invents what we now call decor, the kind of country fresh design work people pay the earth for at some of the fancier fabric outlets, as well as arts and crafts furnishings and textiles that are supposed to make your little suburban home look less Rookery Nook and more Queen Elizabeth slept here. Now, you'd expect a nice middle-class decorator like William Morris to have a favourite colour, right? Well, he does. It's red. And here's where the left-hand turn I mentioned comes in, because Morris is also a revolutionary. In 1883, Morris and Karl Marx's sister and others get together, and a year later Morris founds the Socialist League with uplifting class warfare songs to match.
Come shoulder to shoulder, where the world grows older, help lies in naught but thee and me.
And over on the piano, a couple of canoodling socialist nobodies who are more than just friends, and who are about to become world famous.
Now, those two lovebirds I mentioned, George Bernard Shaw and Annie Besant, first meet when she gets herself embroiled in what becomes known as the Great Contraception Trial. Now, you've got to remember that back then, you can get yourself in deep doo-doo just by putting the words family and planning together. Annie, however, does a good deal more than that. In Britain, she publishes a new book recently arrived from America and called The Fruits of Philosophy. Now, this little book is no big deal to you or me. The stuff in here is so tame, it would cure your insomnia. But boy, does it cook Annie's goose. Let me read you a little bit of the stuff that offends all right-thinking, decent-minded folk back in 1877, gets Annie a fine and 6 months in jail. And I hope you're ready for this. Another check which the old idea of conception has led some to recommend with considerable confidence consists in introducing, previous to connection, a very delicate piece of sponge moistened with water to be immediately afterwards withdrawn by means of a very narrow ribbon attached to it. Lurid stuff, eh? Well, the fine and the sentence turn Annie into a real revolutionary, which accounts for me playing the piano badly here in India, Madras to be specific.
After a couple of decades of fighting the establishment back in England for women's rights, Annie comes out here to India to fight another cause. We Brits are running the place at the time, and Annie reckons we shouldn't be. So she takes on the crazy task of getting the British out of India. Did pretty well. We're out, aren't we?
By 1893, Annie's done courses in spiritualism, hypnotism, and psychic perception, and moved on to various swamis and gurus, and the Indian National Congress, of which by 1917 she will become president and get to know such movers and shakers as Gandhi and Nehru. On the way to the political high life, she also sets up this place, the International Theosophy Headquarters, where courses in comparative religion are given. So Annie has come a long way since tinkling the ivories with down-and-out socialists like George Bernard Shaw. She's now very well known wherever liberals flourish, even America, where she and her gurus go over very big. In 1893, at the Great Columbia Exposition in Chicago, where they fire everybody's imagination. And I don't just mean with the spices in the curry. I mean the curry. Vegetarianism, which by this time has also become the subject of some visionary thinking by another lady who knows a bit about religion. In Michigan.
The lady here in Michigan is Ellen White, a leading member of the 19th century Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ellen White has a series of visions, most of them about the direction the church ought to be going. But as you'll see, from this little visionary home of hers, she changes more than just life in the church. See, one of the things Adventists stand for is moderation in all things, and that includes something close to Annie Besant's heart too, because the Adventist Church discourages its members from taking stimulants of any kind, and from eating meat. At one point, some Adventists visit Dansville, New York, famous for its water cures, cold baths, that sort of stuff, and hygiene and health fit very well with the new Adventist diet. And this is where the Adventist Church begins to affect the rest of us.
Inspired by Dansville, they do this, a 19th century version of what I'm doing. They set up the first real organised health and fitness centre, and it sets a whole new style of living. As a result of which, today, every morning, people like me work up a sweat with some kind of keep fit thing or other. And speaking of sweat, excuse me.
Well, we're almost at the end of our story. In 1866, the Adventists open the Western Health Reform Institute, and 10 years later, invite a young doctor they've sponsored through training to be the superintendent. He changes the name to the Sanitarium, introduces room service and entertainment, and turns this place into where the elite meet. If you're into healthy living, this place is playing your tune.
The new superintendent is quite a guy. 18-hour days, he can dictate letters at 125 words a minute for 48 hours. He dresses only in white and can often be seen with his cockatoo on his shoulder. He does away with some of the more violent water cures and opens schools of nursing, physical education, and home economics. He works everybody to exhaustion on exercise machines known as muscle beaters and makes everybody sit all the time on posture chairs like this. He starves his clients on a diet of water, yogurt, rice, nuts, fresh fruit and veggies, and then he does something that only changes the entire world. Thank you. I'll take the breakfast, please. So, here we are with a new menu for living, thanks to the ingredients that have made up this program.
Electronic agents using feedback techniques developed for wartime guns because of Claude Bernard and all those experiments that kick off the anti-vivisection humane societies, that really start out as lifeboat organisations set up to rescue people from ships using the wind and weather data from Maury, based on telegraphy invented by Samuel Morse, who learns painting from Alston, who's a pal of Coleridge, who works in Malta for Ball, who saves Nelson for Emma, who's worked for the electrical Graham, who's taught by whiskey scientist Black, who knows the sulphuric Roebuck, who bleaches paper that will be decorated by Morris, who's a socialist with Annie Besant, who is a vegetarian, just like the Seventh-day Adventists.
Which is why we end, as I said, with the day that changed the world. Because here, in 1895, the superintendent was trying to invent a healthier kind of bread, and all he came up with was some mushy gunk. So just for kicks, he put it through rollers and baked it. And what came out changed the daily routine of the inhabitants of planet Earth. Today, it's named after the superintendent who produced the original mush. And that is why a program that began with electronic agents in India ends here in Battle Creek, Michigan, with this. Kellogg's cornflakes. Good for my feedback.